Hi, my name is Ben Cheshire, and tonight's story is about someone I've been reporting on for more than 25 years. He's the former Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fischer. In 1992, I wrote that the National Party leader seemed to make a virtue of his ordinariness. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. Over time, I realised there's nothing ordinary about Tim. And recently, as his health faded, Tim's family invited me to join them on what turned out to be almost his last trip to his hometown of Boree Creek. By train, of course.
The event today is a charity train cruise to Boree Creek, which is Tim Fischer's home. With Tim's battle with cancer at the moment, we're just taking the opportunity to spend some time with him and get him out on something that he loves, which he loves train travel and everything about the railways.
Welcome for coming up. Good to see Claire. It's a special train raising funds for the Aubrey Cancer Centre. Over 200 people joining this historic run to Lockhart and Boree Creek from Aubrey.
I think Tim should have been a Prime Minister of Australia, but he missed out by that much.
We are here because Tim won't be with us much longer. I guess we're here in a sense of celebrating his life.
Well, our life's been very different the last 2.5 years that Tim's had MDS and now acute leukaemia. Our life is pretty much home and the hospital.
Kids, we're off. Is this your first decent train trip?
Yes. There does come a time when you've got to decide that, you know, maybe you just want to make best of the time you've got left and fill your days with the things you really want to do. And we're in that phase now.
Well done, horseman.
A patient at the Australian Field Hospital at Woong Tower is Second Lieutenant Tim Fischer. He comes from Boree Creek via Wagga.
Hello folks, surprise. This opportunity to wish you a happy Christmas.
I thank Uncle Sam in Vietnam for 4 cancers: prostate cancer, a bladder cancer, and then a couple of melanomas. I had operations in 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Agent Orange was widely used. At least one specialist has suggested my immunity broke down a lot more quickly as a direct consequence.
Most people, certainly the doctors treating him, believe that's a very plausible link. And this particular cancer he has now is one of those that is usually through chemical exposure.
It does seem like a cruel price to pay for serving a country.
Yes, that's true.
It's plainly not something to be taken lightly. And all of those issues focus one's minds on the future and what it means for those who will be there when you're gone.
Pick up the scones there. Flo Bjelke-Petersen's pumpkin scones?
No, definitely not.
Definitely not.
I wouldn't compete.
Morning tea at the Fischer farm near Wagga in New South Wales. It's the first time a film crew has been allowed here, so a rare glimpse of the man behind the politician, the man who claims to be the voice of rural Australia.
I'm just, I think, a fairly normal Australian ex-army officer, farmer, and parliamentarian and party leader.
Tim was a boy from the bush down in the Riverina. He went to Vietnam. He served in the state parliament. He came to the federal parliament in 1990.
When the National Party's top strategists sat down to design a commercial around Tim Fischer, they came up with this. To some, it just confirmed the view that Fischer can look a bit, well, goofy, Or putting it nicely, that he's a kind of earnest plodder. I'm going to read out some of the words that have been used to describe you. Tell me if you think there is some truth in them. Hard-working.
I would hope so.
Sincere.
I would hope so.
Idiosyncratic.
I think that's been exaggerated, but I'm relaxed about that.
He had a passion for trains. He was obsessed about his Akubra hat. He was an eccentric. And of course, eccentrics don't go down well in politics. I can remember when Tim was elected leader of the National Party in Canberra. The reaction was almost universal. He was dismissed as somebody who was destined to become a failure, dismissed without having much impact whatsoever.
And to think that this person would be the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia in a coalition government.
National Party leaders I'd been used to dealing with the Sinclairs, the Doug Antonys. They were extremely intelligent, focused, head-kicking politicians. Tim was their polar opposite.
What exactly is the government's position? When will you make this position clear?
You never thought of Tim as a great intellect. Actually, he was a very considerable thinker, but nobody ever thought that about him.
Check. Oh, good, very good, Tim.
Tim always knew he was a bit quirky.
How long have you been in politics, Tim? Obviously not long enough. You haven't worked out how to be dirty.
He'd often been seen or portrayed, you know, even negatively for his quirks and his eccentricities and his obsessive type interests in things, or as I prefer to say, his deep interest rather than obsessive.
They're looking at each other. Happy.
We'd met in about 1984 and eventually became engaged in 1992.
And how do you feel about possibly being Mrs. Deputy Prime Minister in a few months?
No, I could soon be Mrs. Fischer and Judy Brewer, and that's about as far as I'll take it from there.
Well, the federal election date was the last concern today for National Party leader Tim Fischer.
If anyone was to say Tim was ordinary, I would challenge them. Totally, I think he's the most extraordinary man I've ever met. I think that's why I'm marrying him, actually. He's a very interesting person. He lives life to the full. What he does in one day, some of us wouldn't do in a month. And I think that's certainly not ordinary.
The coalition under John Howard swept to power last night, not so much in a landslide as an avalanche.
It's a great night to be leader of a national party, and the coalition's looking very good. Full credit to John Winston Howard.
He was a marvellous partner of mine. We were a great team in the lead up to the 1996 election. We worked together very closely. He was loyal.
Mr. Tim Fischer, the Deputy Prime Minister, who is to be the Minister for Trade.
Tim Fischer's greatest strength as a politician was his fundamental decency. What you knew with Tim is if you reached an agreement with him, he would honour it. And I found that immensely valuable as Prime Minister and having him as Deputy Prime Minister.
A lone gunman, armed with a high-powered rifle, entered the Port Arthur historic site and began firing randomly.
The Port Arthur massacre was a moment of political truth for Tim Fischer. And this highlighted perhaps his greatest quality, sheer courage.
It is about taking out of the suburbs of Australia the semi-automatics and automatics that should not be in the suburbs of Australia in the first place.
He understood that the country and John Howard had to tackle gun laws. He understood this was going to be really difficult for the National Party constituency, but he committed to the cause.
Gun owners were told the proposed
Firearm Owners Association was out in force again.
Save the Queen, because nothing is going to save the National Party.
The gun laws had overwhelming support in the cities, on both sides of politics, but it was very difficult in regional and certain rural areas.
Are you going to give up your gun? No!
Tim Fischer never said to me, John, you can't do this, we can't support it. He said, we'll go along with it, but you have to understand how difficult it's going to be, and it was.
National Party leader Tim Fischer and Prime Minister John Howard remain determined to implement the tough new laws.
I'm sorry, you want automatic weapons reinstated. I don't. I will disagree with you all the very way.
At that stage we were still living on the farm, a very isolated farm, and I was there 9/10 of the time by myself. So when the security issues started to arise from the gun debate, I was perhaps at my most vulnerable, and I felt that the harassment, particularly the phone harassment, was a really difficult thing to live with.
It was not easy on duty. It was not easy on a number of senior ministers. And I got hung in effigy a couple of times, most notably at the Gympie meeting.
I think on the Labor side, we always understood how hard the guns issue had been for him. We appreciated his good-heartedness, but we also appreciated his political courage.
And the fringe elements can go to Mars.
He, in some ways, is very much a social conservative, but Tim was always prepared to rethink and reassess. He became a champion of the Republic.
Mr. Fischer.
He became a champion of an integrated multicultural Australia.
Mr. Fischer.
He'd fought Pauline Hanson.
Hello and goodbye. See you, Tim.
He was deeply opposed to racism, and he had an abiding dedication to the veteran community, going right back to his time as a national serviceman in Vietnam. I think there's a touch of Tim becoming less conservative as he got older, and I think he was enormously influenced by his wife.
All the time that I've known him, he's been in Parliament. All our married life, he's been leader of the National Party. And it's always been a constant struggle with himself as to how much time to devote to his private life versus his public life.
Tim has always maintained a punishing schedule. He'd in fact been hectically busy as Trade Minister, travelling the globe.
Canberra, it was really a very complicated time in our lives. Harrison was born in 1993 and Dom in 96. They were very difficult years for a lot of reasons. Look, I think I knew from the very start that something about Harrison was different. We did bounce around different paediatricians and specialists for a long time till someone finally mentioned the word autism, probably 3 years later. We were told it will affect him for his whole life. He will probably never live independently. He will probably never have a job. He will probably never be able to do things that other children, adults do.
It was shattering, it was disappointing, it was challenging, and initially I pushed back against it in a somewhat crazy way. But we loved him, he was our eldest son.
For me, it was a relief. I finally had a word. I didn't know what the word meant, but I finally had a word that I could sort of work with.
And this, of course, is the auction for the Tim Fischer Akubra.
Having seen the reports on Harrison, I think there was an element of my realising that I was on the spectrum. I never obtained an official diagnosis or anything, but I have certain methodologies to handle scheduling and other factors in a way which might be described as a degree of autism or being on the spectrum, certainly.
The all-time record price ever sold Akubra anywhere on the planet Earth. Good luck.
Tim can reel off train timetables and aeroplane schedules and even bus departure times from all around the world.
And a gearbox. There's actually a gearbox.
That's part of his quirkiness. An extraordinary memory and head for numbers that sometimes comes with a mild place on the spectrum.
Diesel with about a 1 foot wide piston
maybe a bit more, half a metre.
In fact, I can remember the moment it just hit me, and it was reading the book by Tony Attwood, Asperger's Syndrome, and realised it was actually about Tim, not about Harrison.
I am Tim Fischer, Federal Leader of the National Party, riding your tram to stop number 41.
That actually helped me a lot in understanding that he thought differently too. It wasn't just Harrison who thought differently, Tim did as well. Slowly it started to make sense of why he'd always felt a little bit of an outsider, but I think it gives him some comfort to, you know, be now part of an autistic tribe.
Hello, Doms. How are you? Hey, Doms. Hey, Harrison. You've been colouring. Lots of colour. They've been doing it. It's the highest point in the world.
You just cannot put yourself under the sort of schedule pressure that I've had to endure forever. Something had to give.
Have you been for a swim today?
Little swim? Haven't been for a swim. We've
No
been to
swim.
the park.
There's no doubt both Harrison and Dominic's needs caused me to think and get the priorities right and leave politics, or leave frontbench politics a couple of years earlier than what might have otherwise been the case. And by that process, they may well have saved my life.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I announce that as a consequence of the convergence of certain political factors and certain personal factors, I've decided to step down.
I was a little surprised when Tim announced he was going to step aside. I accepted the reason that he did, and I was disappointed to lose him.
You are one of the very genuinely loved people in this place. You're going to be very much missed by us. Yeah. He was a vibrant presence, really, in Parliament in an odd sort of way. And when he left Parliament, the Parliament was poorer for it.
Good luck to you all, and God bless you all.
That very emotional response from both sides of politics was a bit much. It certainly made me feel very humble.
That last week he was in Parliament, we had the Australian Story accompany us to Northern Territory, I think, and with the kids.
It is nice to be on the Wombat Trail again, albeit a final one in my current capacities, and it's just a delight to have the kids running around safely as part of this farewell trail.
Oh, this trip is a very unusual trip for the Fishers. It's a chance for us to travel together as a family, which is certainly not the norm, and it's probably come about a bit spontaneously. People often ask, was Harrison's autism the factor that made Tim leave politics? And I think I can say no, it wasn't. I think it was literally parenthood. We just needed to be a family again.
Pick the ball up. And little pass. Well done.
School for Harrison was always quite a challenge. We moved to maybe like 5 different schools when we were younger. Harrison was bullied probably throughout. The first thing you'll notice with Harrison is you have to call him Harrison. You can't shorten his name in any way.
They called me Harry mostly, which really hurt my feelings and made me very angry. Found it abusive and stuff.
Autistic people, when they're in an environment that is not supportive of autistic people, become anxious. And the most obvious thing is when you're anxious, you can't learn.
He devised ways of handling his circumstance. He was not going to be the leader of the peer group in the playground, kicking a soccer ball, but he was going to have a lot of friends in the library, and it was Harrison finding a place in which he could kick his own goals.
Autism is a special type of person that is different to other people who have different skills and stuff, but is very socially secluded and stuff.
Harrison has been assessed at different parts of the spectrum all his life. Mostly it's been moderate, so somewhere in the middle.
I don't think I would be who I am without it, so everything is stuff that makes you unique, and for me, autism is one of the big things that makes me unique. That had probably been the biggest Pokemon fan in my age group.
Let's start. What have we got to do before I head home?
2 dinners, make a lunch. When I got older, I wanted a lot more independence and being able to do things myself.
Okay, we've got some. How many will you have?
2 dinners worth of 4.
So can you carry these over?
I think 4.
Harrison does need help in doing everyday tasks, but from what was him needing help 24 hours a day, he now needs only a tiny bit of help to get himself off to work. How do you want them?
What do you suggest?
Want them boiled? Skins on, skins off?
I'm confused. You just get me confused.
Too many questions, I know. He still has anxiety. He's very rigid. He still eats the same thing every day, has his routines.
Yeah.
Do you think it's time we got a new drinker?
No.
Sure?
I'm sure.
How many years?
I don't know.
I reckon it's probably getting for its decade. As a parent of a child with disability or an adult with a disability, of course you wonder what's going to happen if you're not there.
And Saturday we go to Melbourne.
And Saturday we go to Melbourne to see Dad. Yay.
At the start of 2017, Dad became very sick and he was diagnosed with a form of leukemia.
Myeloid acute leukemia, and that's proving a very tough battle.
I struggle to think about what he says with that because it's a bit sad.
What's a bit sad?
That Dad's not well and he could die any day, probably.
How did the Premier League go last night?
Yeah, we beat Southampton 3-0. So we're level with Man City and Liverpool on points after they drew.
Oh, that's terrific.
I suppose Tim's recent health issues have brought the whole idea of Harrison's independent living into a sharper focus.
Okay, Harrison, well, I better let you go.
Bye. Bye.
Harrison is paying his way in the community. He's doing his job. He's getting a modest pay. He gets to pay income tax and superannuation.
I hope he gets better, but it's hard.
But I will eventually leave, sooner or later, this planet Earth, in the knowledge that Harrison is now far better placed than he was 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Who's playing Richmond tonight, Harrison?
Hopefully he will miss me whenever that happens, but it'll be a case of cheerio to Harrison, cheerio to a whole lot of people and good friends over the years who have helped me, and particularly Judy. But that's life.
We heard this train was coming through. A train coming through like this, a tourist train, is a novelty to us. And Tim Fischer's been an icon around this area for years, and I thought, well, it'd be a great opportunity to welcome the train on horseback. Somebody came up with the idea, well, we should hijack the train and get Tim Fischer's hat. But anyway, he wasn't real accepting of that, so we decided to have a guard of honour for Tim as he went by. Because of Tim's health, we think this may be one of his last trips out this way.
3 cheers for Tim Fischer! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip!
Oh, it's always special coming to Boree Creek, and it's been such an enormous part of all our lives.
Done.
Really happy? Really happy?
Being at home in Boree Creek is uplifting always. It's an anchor to my life over decades. Well, I'm obviously in my twilight years. I look in the direction of my old school, the church, the hall. Well, it's farewell to Vietnam and welcome back from Vietnam.
When we come back here, we forget how much his community loves him, and I think he finds that hard. He doesn't think he deserves all that accolade, but he does. He's done amazing things for this community.
And he's always been genuine and honest.
Yeah.
There's what you see is what you get with Tim. You've never had that facade that the others put out.
If today's politicians had half the integrity and honesty that Tim has, we'd be a lot better off.
I would appeal to my colleagues post-elections to call a spade, then people might listen to what you have to say. But the moment they detect spin, they don't like it, and fair enough.
Tim has found it hard to retreat when there are so many really critical issues, particularly in rural Australia with the drought, climate change, and all the things that we see every day as farmers. So he finds it hard to hold back.
He's lost weight, he's lost energy, and as a family we all can see it. But that he's still Tim. But he is fighting the fight, and he won't give up easily.
It gives me great pleasure to announce today that the Boree Creek Community Park will be known as the Tim Fischer Community Park.
Our time together is enriched because we know it's coming to an end. And you value everything you do together, and you live your life as we all should live it, that we don't know what tomorrow holds. So in many ways, my life's been enriched through him having to come to terms with the fact that he won't be here forever.
The driver, well done. Thank you, sir.
He should be remembered as an authentic Australian bloke. He cared about country people, but he didn't want to represent them in a way that caused division within the Australian community, and in that sense he should be remembered with great affection by people who want decent people in public life.
I'd like to give 3 cheers to Boree Creek and a big rain soon. Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip! There's a great Italian word, basta. It means enough. So enough of this nonsense. Lunch awaits.
This is a one-off, idiosyncratic Australian.
That's one. Hey. Bravo.
He left us all better off. He warmed our hearts.
I do own slightly better Akubras.
He made a contribution to our public life, and he left us a better country.
That's a great honour. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I've had a great life, a lot to celebrate with my life and my family.